Three words to sum up the Byre. Integral, fun, sublime.
A lifetime's experience.
Byre means absolutely everything to me. Sorry, that's 4 words.
Exciting, haphazard, and artistic.
Everything, in one word.
My granny lived in Pittenweem, and we used to come through here on holidays. And I remember I must have been 5, 6, and she took me to the first incarnation of the Byre, that tiny room. And it was very special, very visceral, completely embedded in my memory. And I remember that sign, in fact, that said, "Please don't put your feet on the stage." And so it's always been part of my life, because when we came through to stay in Pittenweem, we'd often come up to the Byre and see shows. So to then become involved in it later in my life was wonderful. But yes, I've known it all my days.
My first encounter with the Byre was in 1970, when my wife and I took part in a production, and that was the second Byre at that time. We took part in the first amateur production in that new theatre in 1970, playing husband and wife, would you believe? And that was called Reunion in St Andrews, a play that Alec had written, one of many plays he had written, and they were very popular plays with the locals, the amateur productions, the Scots comedies, because they could kind of identify with the characters, and they enjoyed the humour.
I came up to work at Dundee University in 1973 in August, and a friend who lived in Wormit at the time suggested we go to the theatre. It'd be in the autumn sometime. So it was here, to the Byre Theatre. Well, not this one, obviously. Byre Theatre 2. And it was a production of The Merchant of Venice, which involved quite a lot of sword fights, jumping around from high levels and such like. I think it was directed by Ian McKean, but I'm not sure. But yeah, so that was the start of it, really. And then in 1975, once I was married, Carol and I moved here to St Andrews, and obviously most things since then. But 73 was the start, and I just thought then, what a lovely little theatre.
I first encountered the Byre in the 1980s. I was interested in drama, and the Byre was the natural place to go to. And Alec Patterson was a member of the same church as I am, and somehow he must have got to know of my interest, and I was in some of his plays. And then as time went on, he asked me if I wanted to join the Byre board. And that was very exciting, because I was very into women in the theatre, but women everywhere. So I said yes, quickly. And that was very good, because you got to know more about the inside of the theatre, how it works, all the financial implications, and so on. It was very interesting.
My first visit to the Byre and first encounter with it was, I think, around about 1988, 89. And there was a show on under the artistic director Adrian Reynolds called Up in the Gallery, which was about the Victorian musical singer Mary Lloyd, and starred quite a well-known actress called Adrienne Posta. And it was produced at the Byre and was going out on tour. So I came across to see that, and it was a really interesting play. And really well done, but I was really captured by the very intimate atmosphere of the theatre, and particularly the relationship between the stage and the auditorium. And of course, front of house at that time was really tiny as well, so it was a really kind of unique experience.
I experienced all three of the buildings of the Byre Theatre. The original one I experienced as a patron many times, and it was couthy. It was different because it was a cow buyer originally. Alec Patterson, who was the founder of the St Andrews Play Club, ultimately the Byre Theatre, was very involved with theatre generally in local terms, and he always used to remonstrate with his fellow actors and actresses that we really have to get a place of our own to do this. One afternoon, when a group of his friends had been out walking, one simply said, "I see the Abbey Street Dairy Farm's up for rent." And Alec, his ears pricked up at that, came back down from the Kinkell Braes to Abbey Street, had a look at the buildings, looked through the windows, said, "This is a place for us." He then persuaded a group of them to form the St Andrews Play Club, and then they went about mucking out the Byre. Alec really was very forceful in how he envisaged the theatre going forward. But it was very basic, very rudimentary, but here we are in this wonderful modern theatre we have today, thanks to Alex.
The building for the dressing room was a way outside, a way up high, whereas the theatre was here, the low, and the audience was here. And they had to find a way, how could we get these people up there onto the stage? Well, somebody went to the shipbuilding yard in Burnt Island and got a ladder. And they brought the ladder back. It was too long. So a woman had the idea, well, we'll dig a hole and we'll stick it in a bit deeper. And that worked. I mean, you can hardly imagine people, especially in dress costume, coming down from way up there, down this ladder and round about to where they got on. I mean, I don't particularly remember the first Byre. It just seemed extraordinary to me.
Thanks to him, this place exists, because he not only did the administration, everything, he then wrote shows which then brought in the audience, and he wasn't paid much in royalties, and so everything could be done on a shoestring, but thrived and prospered until Fife Council, Scottish Arts Council, everybody became involved and it became much more professional in its sense. He was such a resilient character and full of life, and devoted his life to this place, I have to say.
The Middle Theatre certainly was much more modern, both from acting point of view and from the dressing rooms and audience point of view. Any production I took part in was a high point for me. I thoroughly enjoyed taking part in the amateur productions, and I worked beside a lot of very experienced amateur actors and actresses. People like David Joy, Andrew Suter, Jimmy Cooper, Aileen Dow. They were all memorable, very happy moments.
I think what I liked about Byre Theatre too was its compactness, really. The stage was probably about half the size of the current Byre Theatre stage. It was only about 15 feet deep and about 30 feet wide. So it was quite small, but you could engineer quite complicated sets on them, in that you could get an entrance from a high level over on stage left, and there was an exit on stage right. So, you could achieve good things there. The seating was all in a single bank, just as Byre Theatre 3 is now, and that made it a very nice theatre for actors on stage, because wherever you looked, you were looking at the audience, and that was lovely. However, in the 90s, at that time, everything that we were doing was selling out, particularly in the summer. People couldn't get returns. We could do with more seats to sell. And so it was decided to put seats in the side aisles and make an aisle up the middle of the theatre. Well, it did create about another 38 or 40 seats, I think. But to my mind, although we didn't think it at the time until once it was done, to my mind, it spoilt the theatre, because the best seats in the theatre now weren't there anymore, because there was an aisle there instead, which was a shame. And also the sight lines changed, because audience was sitting right at the side, the wall of the theatre on either side, left and right. So it made what you could do on stage in terms of scenery a little more complex. The audience weren't focused in the middle so much. So I don't. That was good in terms of finances, but I don't think it was particularly good as the theatre.
When I arrived at the Byre, Maggie had done a great deal of work to develop the programme and to really kind of get the community involvement of the theatre going, the Youth Theatre Byre Writers Group and community projects. So there was there was an awful lot going on beyond just putting plays on stage, and they were just doing 5 plays a year at that stage. So coming into that, the audience needed building. It was in a funny stage in that some people had dropped away and new people had come along, but the audiences were inconsistent in numbers, and being funded by Creative Scotland and Fife Council, but not to an enormous extent. It relied really heavily on box office to make it work. So the first challenge that was set to me by the board of the Byre was to really try and focus on building audiences and getting a consistency of production on stage. And it was really interesting because I took a very populist approach to the first season in particular, opening with a show called The Steamy, which was well known at the time, and had been produced by a lot of theatres in Scotland by that stage, and I was thought, oh, well, there might be a bit of steamy fatigue around, but audiences absolutely flocked to it. So the first show sold out completely, and then we followed that, I think, with a thriller, and then I followed on by doing something that Maggie had established, which was a professional production which also involved the members of the youth theatre. And we did a Willie Russell musical called Our Day Out. And also in that first year, because we'd done very well during the season with box office, we were able for the first time in many years to produce an in-house Christmas show for the Byre. So we put that into the season, and again, that did really well. Having started with a deficit at the beginning of the season, which was kind of inherited from previous productions, we were able to turn that around in a surplus in just a year. I'd kind of heard in retrospect that had that first season not worked, then the Arts Council were on the verge of pulling their funding for the theatre. So we then set about looking at what we could do, not only to continue to develop and build the programme, but what we could do to rehouse the Byre in a way that was more suitable for the upcoming 21st century.
I did know the second building really well, both as a member of the board, as a member of the audience, and on that stage a lot. It had so many faults with it because obviously there was no fly floor, the lighting box was at the side. There was many things that didn't work. So the joy of moving from the second incarnation to the new building is it was state of the art, and theatre could really, really sing and dance properly. Having said that, the second building had a great feel to it, and I have some fantastic memories.
The Byre itself, it was really clear as a building wasn't fit for purpose anymore. It had been built in the 1970s to replace the original Byre, which many people will know was originally a cowshed, and much loved by audiences. But the new Byre was basically a breeze block shed with a flat roof. A lot of it was falling apart. It had leaking roofs. It had an electricity installation that had been completely condemned. The public areas were not especially pleasant to sit in and enjoy. But the one thing that everybody liked about the Byre was the relationship between the stage and the audience, and the fact that it was intimate.
So if we look at the second incarnation, as we'll call it, it was a great little theatre, but it was getting quite tired towards the end of its life. We must be in the year 1996, 7 back then. So I can't remember now; it's so long ago. And it was getting very tired. And we knew we were going to have to do something. So do we patch it or whatever? Around the same time, guess what happened? The National Lottery started.
We were wanting to just improve Byre Theatre 2, but the Arts Council said that we just weren't being ambitious enough, that we should just knock it down, start again.
And so there's suddenly a huge new world out there for capital projects for arts buildings and artistic organisations. So we began to research that. And as a result of that, we stimulated the Scottish Arts Council to look at the whole project. And they suddenly had an awful lot more money in terms of their capital projects than they had before. And I remember head of the lottery fund at that time was a gentleman called David Bonner, a great guy. And he came and we said, we'd like to do this, we'd like to do that. And he said, think bigger.
And we put an application in, and again, to our surprise, we got it. And that started the process of the new building. And I suppose that's the biggest legacy that I share with the people who were involved in creating the new Byre. And that's all the board members and our brilliant chair, Neil Anderson, who was there throughout my time as artistic director, and Tom Gardner, who was the general manager here at the time. It's something we all put a huge amount of energy and love and care into, and trying to get the community on board with it. The fact that we were then to get it open and running, and after actually quite a lot of resistance from local audiences about why we needed to change the Byre at all, because people obviously didn't understand the complexities of the failures of the previous building.
The building itself was in considerable need of repair and renewal. And when the Arts Council said that there was funding going to be available for the artistic community through the lottery funding, we couldn't turn it down. With no money of our own anyway, to do anything other than do basic repairs to the middle theatre. But when the Arts Council came along with this big pot of money for the new theatre, it was exciting. It was a long road, and sometimes fraught with great difficulties, but we did eventually get it open, thankfully, and it is a building worthy of what Alec started way back in 1933.
People were very sad on the night that Byre Theatre 2 closed for the last time, and we did lots of things like we didn't close the tabs and all that sort of thing, because people were quite emotional about it. It was sad, you know, because there'd been a lot of theatre created there, a lot of really good theatre, and a lot of people really loved the building. So it was quite sad. And the last play that I directed at the Byre, on that night we would take the set down, and then it would be collected the next day and so on. And I slept that night on the Byre Theatre stage. I just felt that was my little thing for the Byre Theatre 2. I had a sleeping bag and I just kept on the stage. I mean, the building, as it cooled down, used to make a lot of noises, and I did wonder whether it was a good idea at some time during the night, but no, I just slept on the stage. It's rather nice.
So we held an architectural competition for a series of architectural firms, all of whom put in plans for what they thought this new theatre should be. And Nicol Russell from Dundee were successful. They'd done Dundee Rep, and so we then got in touch with them, and they became our architects, and they did a great job. Okay, we had challenges along the way, but they've built a really good building. The knock-on of that, of course, is that the footprint of the new theatre was going to be considerably bigger than the footprint of the existing building. So that then involved us buying adjoining buildings and then knocking them down. And so we then went ahead with Fife Council. They still own effectively the building and it's leased. So they were the landlords, as it were. And so the politics was very involved, and we had to get heavily involved with Fife Council, the Scottish Arts Council, the Lottery Fund and so on, in order to progress the move into the third building, which then involved, as I say, creating a gap site in the centre of St Andrews for a long period of time.
Most people were just really excited about the new theatre opening, because it did drag on quite a long time. People had, you know, it was a long time before they saw the other Byre getting pulled down, and then the house next door to it that we had to buy to create more space was pulled down and the site cleared. But then the theatre took quite a long time to start appearing.
We had kind of planned really carefully how to structure our way out of the old Byre in terms of then starting the build, what we would do while the build was going on, and then what we would do going into the new building. And what was supposed to be an 18-month programme slowly and steadily became 4 years of torture. And I had planned at least half a dozen opening seasons, none of which came to fruition, because every time we planned something, the goalposts moved.
And it is quite poignant, because we knew that we were just about to knock all that down and go into literally the void of what next. And that was a difficult period when we were dark, but we took shows out on the road.
And I do remember the Byre continued in a certain way. I know that we worked in Anstruther Town Hall, and at the time Tom Gardner was the manager there. And he said to me, would you like to go and manage the shows that we're putting on? Well, I had never managed anything like that before. So I thought, yes, okay. And that was great fun, because it was bringing in an audience from Anstruther. And that's a good audience anyway. They come here to the Byre regularly anyway, But that was good fun, and it was bringing me a bit of a challenge, doing something different.
Ken Alexander had been the one to close Byre Theatre 2. You know, the pantomime Hansel and Gretel had been the last show on there, and he was one to open the new one. And in between, you know, I'd done shows in the town hall, in the Crawford Arts Centre, on tour. So he tried to keep the light of theatre alive in St Andrews, you know, professional light of theatre, just as the Play Club had tried to keep the light on as well.
I loved the old building because of its sense of intimacy, and I was really aware from the word go of the Byre's really rich history, and the fact that it had started with the passions of a local amateur group and a professional writer, A.B. Patterson, and that history was very much part of how we wanted to move the theatre forward. So although I enjoyed the second building, I think the third building just gave us so many opportunities to exploit what must have been A.B. Patterson's vision of getting a professional theatre going in St Andrews.
When the building began to come out of the ground, it was extraordinarily exciting. It was also very challenging because, you know, we hit, as every big project does, problems, money, and so on. And so there was what were called value management exercises, which is another word for saying cost cutting. But we didn't pare it to the bone by any means. You can see it in the proof is in the pudding and the beautiful building that's now here. So the third building was a labour of love, let's put it that way. And I still get a bit of a buzz, frankly, every time I come here.
Once the doors opened to the new building, they completely embraced it, and everyone said, and this was my favourite bit, everyone said, oh, it's just like the old Byre, but it's brand new. So that's the thing I think I'm probably most proud of.
We'd waited all these years for the theatre. We couldn't wait. I'd had a wee look in occasionally. I'd been able to see what was going on, so I knew the building. But people came in and were absolutely hypnotised by it. I mean, you come in the reception area and it is quite exceptional. And you look down and there's a cafeteria, and you look up, what's up there, the offices. I think it's an amazing building. It's absolutely beautiful.
I just could not come up with anything that felt like the right project to celebrate the opening of a brand new building that would really engage a broad kind of community. And the more I thought about it, the idea of going on an adventure but not knowing what the ending was going to be, and indeed looking at what happy endings were and might not be, which is what the musical explores, what happens after happy ever after. I thought, well, actually, Into the Woods is a really interesting concept for the whole journey of what the Byre is doing. We're going into the woods. We don't know what this youth theatre will be able to do, but we're going to do our damnedest to make it work. And we're going to go on an adventure. We want the audience to become part of that adventure. So we booked it in for a 5.5-week run, and everyone thought we were mad. But actually, the minute it went on sale, tickets started to fly out the door, because the fact that it was the first show of the new theatre, people wanted to see what the theatre was like. The idea of the show seemed to grab their attention, and we actually sold out the entire run, much to everyone's amazement. So I was very pleased that culturally we were able to do something as ambitious and big as that, and it was totally beyond the scope of what the Byre had ever tried to do artistically previously. But even more happily was the fact that the community bought into it, and it did really well.
So it was just such a relief to get to September 2001 and this show to be on, and it was a spectacular show. No one had seen anything like that in St Andrews before. So that's one for the memory books as well.
And then when the theatre opened, that was just fantastic.
Sir Sean Connery came along to see everyone, and Sir Sean came around, met all the staff, introduced himself and said hello. I introduced myself as Miss Moneypenny, which made everyone laugh, and the evening just continued to be a really, really good night. It
was exciting. It was a brilliant theatrical experience. And it tested the theatre to its extremes, because obviously we now had a fly floor, we had all sorts of great sound equipment, and so it worked superbly well.
When we moved into this current building, of course, almost anything that could be done in any other theatre suddenly became possible. You know, there's traps in the stage, there's a fly tower, scenery can fly. I mean, the first play I directed in the theatre, this theatre, Byre Theatre 3, was Carol's play called Matahari. And in that, you know, we could fly bits of hard scenery that you'd never been able to do before. So it was lovely to be able to do that sort of thing.
I think from an audience point of view, it's that intimacy that has never been lost, and that's what we were trying to create when we built the new theatre, was not to lose the majesty of the intimacy that we had with the first incarnation and still with the second incarnation. Okay, it was a much cheaper building, but it had a great feeling. The only thing is, obviously, with Central Isles were not a great idea. So it feels really good now. I think the way that the configuration is there, I think the architects did a marvellous job, and that's been retained. So the artistic side comes from the feeling within the audience that they're part of the show in many ways.
It was the same for the artistic directors were here. You know, they could come from another, you know, large theatre, and they could emulate what they used to do here, because there was nothing in the theatre of a technical sense that would stop them, because it was as good as any other theatre might be. So really the range of things that they could produce here probably expanded considerably. It didn't have to be more standard plays of a single set. You know, there could be plays that involved, you know, multiple sets and multiple locations, and things could be achieved much more easily.
I think what was also most thrilling about that was seeing how much more widely the Byre was accessible to the local community, and how much the local community bought into the Byre as an organisation. St Andrews was also always a really interesting place to programme for, because you had three distinct audiences. You had the local residents, you had the university population coming and going, and still a massive amount of tourism in St Andrews, not only from around the world, but very specifically, there was still a great tradition of people from the West Coast coming over to the East Coast in July. So, and to be able to see that working in terms of audience numbers, but also the engagement through the writers groups, the youth theatre, through projects we were doing with schools, through more direct connection with local amateur groups and the university student groups who were interested in theatre. And then we had a big project called Heydays.
Yes, Heydays was a fantastic experiment. We had at the time an education officer, and she had been to some theatre across the border in England, and she came back with this idea. And this was about some activities for the over 50s. Well, I was in that category, and I was very happy to be involved. We had a steering committee, and then we got started. We had singing, we had dancing, we had playwriting, we had acting, we had pottery, which was a terrific thing, sewing, so many activities during the day. It was on a Tuesday, starting at 9 in the morning and finished at 4. And there were so many rooms in the Byre that we could occupy. It was a very, very good experience.
I honestly don't think Alec Patterson would have expected a building like this. Not that there's anything wrong with it. He would not have envisaged a theatre such as it is, with all the modern facilities that it has. All three have their place and their part in the history, and all play their part equally.
When there's shows getting rehearsed and sets built and all the rest of it, this hive of activity, the theatre is alive, you know, day and night. You know, it's just a wonderful place, and a coming together of lots of people with lots of different sorts of artistic talents merging to produce a show, and, you know, combining their efforts. But when we didn't have any funding to do that, and that stopped, and we became a receiving house, we just became, well, in many ways, a building which happened to be a theatre in a town which could receive other people's work. So we had to start trying to find other ways of creating things here.
That was Alec's whole purpose. It was to bring theatre to the community in St Andrews, and preferably from a company that worked within the Byre Theatre.
It's had its rocky times. Happily, the university's now taken stock of the place, and to their great credit, they're investing in people here, investing in the building, and hopefully investing in the future. So where would I like it to go? Well, back to where it was, which is at the heart of the community of St Andrews and North East Fife, at the heart of Scottish theatre and music, at the heart of creativity, Because the one thing that we have lost, and this is a sadness to me, is that when we built this building, it was specifically to have it as a producing house.
Yeah, I would like to say embrace your local theatre and let the theatre embrace you, because that opportunity to engage in a live performance space is unique and it's really special, and so much of our lives can be explored and expressed through the experience of live theatre. So yes, keep coming to the theatre and keep making theatre.
Theatre essentially is telling a story. That's what I say to actors. We've got to tell the story. Unless you tell the story, there's no point. I mean, you can dress it up with fancy sets and you can have people dancing, you can have lots of music and so on, but unless you tell the story, there's no point in doing it, because that's what it all comes from. It's storytelling.
It's that experience of being in a black box with other people, seeing something that excites you, challenges you, and takes you somewhere that you didn't expect to go and makes you look at life with a different shade and hue, is what theatre should be.
Amateur theatre has always been very important to the Byre. I mean, it created it in the first place and was part of the artistic output always, and still is. And I think if the theatre in its current form can, continue to energise that, certainly the technical team here, can't be bettered in terms of help for groups that want to bring things here. And there are several groups like the Play Club and like the Geysers and like the musical societies as well. And I hope they continue, because they always have a strong community following. And, the theatre is one particular place where town and gown can meet. And I think it's nice if there are, community shows going on here, as well as student shows and other shows that are created here, professional shows created, because then there's going to be a mixture of audiences as well. And I think that's good for everyone. So I think that's another thing that I'd like to see, a continuing encouragement of community involvement in the theatre. And it doesn't have to be just on stage. I mean, it's through volunteering here and helping here in other ways as well.